Recently I've been focusing a bit on live streams, which have been quite successful. I've got good feedback from those, and I'll still continue to do those. But I'm also going to keep making regular videos like this one. Um, I want to talk about a very, very, very important subject, one of the most important subjects in the world today, in fact, and that is the increasing role of China. Um, I've just been looking over a report in Canada's National Post from the 31st of August, and it's talking about the report is by Stuart Thompson. I'll put a link in this video. The report is about how China under the CCP, if you don't know what that means, Chinese Communist Party, is increasingly using hostage diplomacy. Now, perhaps the most glaring example of this is the case of the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They're both Canadian nationals, and they've been held in China since 2018 on trumped up charges of espionage. Now, in about 2 years, they haven't faced any trial. They've had no access to lawyers and minimal access contact with their families. This is how the Chinese regime operates. Um, and ostensibly, this is basically revenge for the fact that Huawei spokeswoman Meng Wanzhou is being held in Vancouver. If you contrast the cases, she's being held in Vancouver on an American warrant, that is at least on an American initiation, uh, on allegations that Huawei is flouting sanctions against Iran. China, of course, is furious about this. But contrasts the treatment. She has had access to lawyers. She has had the full freedom of the city of Vancouver. She has been treated in a very humane way. She has even had protesters demonstrating in her favour. Contrast to this to the case of the two Michaels, and it just shows you how free nations compare to the Chinese regime. Um, I think now more than ever, we really, really need to understand what this regime is about. I have a big fear about China. It's not so much the behaviour of the CCP itself. They're going to do what they're going to do. It's more the sheer number of fools and appeasement that's going on in Western countries and elsewhere. The number of people who still do not recognise the threat that China poses, who still think, despite everything that's happened, and I'll get into that in a minute, but despite everything, they still think we can have relations as normal with China. The successive US administrations and other Western governments have long felt that if we have good relations with China, then they will reform naturally. So, with a growing economy, there will be political reform and they will gradually open up. The last 7 years under Xi Jinping is showing that the exact opposite has happened. It's only got more authoritarian. But it's if China was authoritarian in of itself, that would be bad enough from a human rights perspective. But even if you want to disregard that, even if you're of the position, well, that's your internal affairs, I don't agree with that because I think the world's interconnected, and I think that you cannot ignore oppression anywhere. But even if you want to ignore that and think of purely domestic sovereignty issue, China does, in my opinion, pose an existential threat to the rest of the world. Because under Xi Jinping, China hasn't been content to just have an iron grip of power at home. China has shown its ambitions, building artificial islands in the Pacific, for example, um, picking an increasing number of fights with neighbors such as India, Vietnam, um, making threats towards smaller neighbors, uh, debt hostage diplomacy, essentially getting small nations into debt and keeping them on strings. So small Pacific nations really have no choice. They can't stand up to China on their own. This is why the Belt and Road Initiative needs to be seriously scrutinized. Um, and in the West, we continue to host, for example, Confucius Institutes. Now, Confucius Institutes on the surface are just cultural exchange bodies based on Western universities. Recently, Sweden abolished its last remaining Confucius Institute, and hopefully, an increasing number of universities will wake up and realize that these institutes are not just about culture. This is so-called soft power. It looks harmless on the surface. It's a bit like Disney's Mulan. You might think, oh, it's just an entertaining film. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll see just how tied in that is with the communist regime. Make no mistake about it. Everything in China, everything, every business, every company, every outlet that pretends to just be about culture has CCP connections. So that's why I feel we need to seriously scrutinize all our ties to China. Now, to be clear here, I'm not saying, oh, let's just cut off all links to China. And I'm not saying, incidentally, let's treat all Chinese nationals as spies. Of course not. I think probably the majority of Chinese nationals in the West are just normal people who are here to study or work. However, I do think we should take a more assertive stance. For example, I believe that Chinese students who want to wave the Chinese flag, bully their Hong Kong peers, and promote Chinese nationalism, they need to be bluntly told that they're guests in this country and they're expected to behave appropriately. If they're promoting nationalism in our countries, that's a sign of arrogance and a sign of disrespect. And I think that there's a lot of Westerners, and they can be found primarily on the left, but some on the right as well, because they have business ties, um, who conflate xenophobia with legitimate concerns about what is going on here. Now, what is xenophobia? Xenophobia would be giving a Chinese person a hard time because they're Chinese. No other reason. That would be xenophobia. And I'm not going to say that's totally non-existent. For example, if someone of East Asian appearance is heckled or bullied because of the coronavirus, that's wrong. That's xenophobia. But frankly, I'm a little bit sick and tired of this idea that the West always needs to pander to Chinese sensitivities. I mean, China under the CCP is not tolerant of dissent. It's not tolerant of different opinions. And therefore, I don't see why we should tolerate their opinions. I don't see why we should give a platform to communists who want to promote their lies in the West. What I mean by that is I think we need to get very assertive. And I'm furious with Western institutions that show weakness. One example of this is Ofcom, Britain's Ofcom. CGTN, which is a Chinese state network, formerly known as CCTV, has offices in Chiswick and West London. Now, granted, CGTN doesn't have a massive audience in the UK. It probably only goes into the thousands. Nevertheless, this is a network that has aired forced confessions, including of the British national Peter Humphreys. In my opinion, they don't deserve any platform in this country because this goes against the nature of a free press. This goes against the nature of independent journalism, holding power to account when they are directly working for a power system, i.e., the Chinese government. I mean, you cannot differentiate between CGTN and Chinese government, despite what they say. The same with Huawei. Every company in China, every network that has any sort of significance whatsoever will have direct CCP ties. You can be absolutely sure of that because it's the only way they can get into that position of power in the Chinese system. It's the only way. As such, we cannot just treat them like another company or another network. We just can't. I believe that if we give them, what's the expression? If we give them a foot, they take a mile. I really do believe this. I believe this is a critical juncture in world history. And whilst I am absolutely critical of Donald Trump, one good thing about the Trump presidency, if nothing else, at least he's toughened the rhetoric. Now, I don't believe that Trump has been consistent, and this is what Trump supporters, including his supporters in Hong Kong and Taiwan, need to understand. He hasn't been consistent. Trump supported the Uyghur concentration camps. So I don't buy this line that Trump can be held up as some great um, representative of Western freedom. I don't think he is. And I don't think that Donald Trump personally cares about human rights. However, at least the rhetoric has changed, and that is a good thing. Joe Biden, whilst I think he's more statesmanlike than Donald Trump, I do have serious concerns about his resolve on China. Right now, there needs to be strength from Western leaders. That means toughening the rhetoric, not just for the sake of it, but because that is the assertive realpolitik. That is actually the realpolitik right now. This idea that we can continue to just take Chinese insults. Take, for example, when a Chinese state newspaper called Australia, which is a close British ally, chewing gum on our shoes. That is the contempt that the CCP has. And every every time this happens without serious rebuke, they get just more and more confident, more assertive. So the danger with hostage diplomacy is China will find any excuse to pick up teachers or tourists or anyone, potentially anyone, um, on trumped up charges. I'm not suggesting that they're going to arrest every Westerner. They're not going to do that. But I think they will try to pick out people at random on trumped up charges and kind of use them for hostage diplomacy, pretty much like terrorist tactics. I mean, this is a thug regime, and anyone who thinks that they will, use the normal code of conduct in terms of diplomacy, I think they don't understand the nature of this regime. This is a regime that has lied to the Chinese people for 71 years. So, can we really believe that they will be honest with the rest of the world? Let's not forget, this was a regime that lied to the World Health Organization about the true nature of COVID. We're all paying the price for Chinese lies. And whilst I believe that every government is responsible for its own actions and its own response to COVID, and I think Trump and Bolsonaro, for example, should take a lot of blame for their handling of the crisis, and Johnson here in the UK, nothing changes the fact that in those first critical weeks, China was basically covering it up. They threatened the doctors who tried to report this, um, like Dr. Li Wenliang and others. What's happening right now? China is, promoting how wonderfully it's handled this. In fact, it's now using coercive and bullying measures towards European countries to try and get them to promote it in a positive light. If you cannot see what China is doing here, throwing its weight around, you really, really need to wake up. Um, so, like I mentioned, Ofcom, they haven't done a damn thing about CGTN. Pathetic. And we still see a very dangerous situation where powerful Western companies like Google and Facebook are still pandering to Chinese sensitivities and Chinese demands. I really, really believe that a bully only understands one language, and that's force. I honestly believe the way the Chinese regime operates, if they sense the slightest sign of weakness, they will walk all over people. Now, I'm not just saying that showing strength will mean that they'll suddenly back off. No, but they are bad. They're not mad. Um, and I just feel very concerned about the future direction because if we don't see strong American leadership, and let's face it, this will come down to the United States because as powerful as Canada, Britain, Australia, France, and so on are, um, only the United States is more powerful than China. Only the United States. That's why those of us who may not like Donald Trump, this is bigger than Donald Trump. It really, really is. I think Trump's a disgrace in many ways, but frankly, Trump, he could get another 4 years, but even if it gets another 4 years, he'll be out of office in 2025, right? This is about this century, okay? This goes well above any individual, it even goes above Xi Jinping. This is about the future direction of the world. And if China is allowed to get into that number one position, I'm not just talking economics, I'm talking about control of the internet, for example, we are all going to pay a price. I don't think it will be inconceivable that in the not too distant future, we will find that it will be difficult to criticize the CCP online in Western countries because the CCP will be controlling the majority of software. I don't think this is paranoid. I think it's very conceivable. Um, so I really, really think there's a lot more that we can do. I think we need to wake up in the West. If China insults us, for example, as I've done with our Australian allies, we need to frankly give as good as we get. We need to not be afraid to insult them back. You know, this nature, particularly this British understatement, we're disappointed. It's just not good enough. I honestly think the time has come to seriously consider if things escalate, expelling Chinese diplomats. I mean, why not? We've done it with the Russians. And I'm not suggesting it means they will back off, but at least it's a sign of strength. At least it shows Beijing that we're not messing around. And I don't take any pleasure from any of this. A big part of my life has been about China. You know, I've been to the country twice. I've worked there twice. Although I can honestly say I've never ever promoted CCP propaganda, and nor would I. You know, I take no pleasure from this. And I have to say, my own time there was mostly positive. None of this is about the Chinese people per se. So I will still maintain Chinese people are often generous, helpful, open-minded. Well, at least as open-minded as they can be under a system where they're taught from an early age to love the party. But you know, you get intelligent individuals that aren't necessarily CCP stooges. But I really believe if we are in a new Cold War, we have to be assertive. During the last Cold War, there were times that the West wasn't assertive and the Soviets got the upper hand. We can't make the same mistake again. Now, the West prevailed in the long run because people were tired of living under the communist system. But I believe this is potentially more complex than the last Cold War because you have the addition of the internet, cyber security, all that sort of thing. That didn't exist from 1945 to 1991. It wasn't an issue. And there was a hotline directed between Moscow and London and Moscow and Washington. Right now, I think the situation is more complex. Also, China's a lot more powerful than it was in 1949. So was Russia, incidentally. Relations between China and Russia are very good right now. I don't believe China has any true allies. However, there are countries that it has good working relationship with, such as Pakistan and Russia. Um, and you know, Russia's also an adversary, a powerful adversary. So we should make no mistake about this, about the level of challenge that we face. But I think there's a lot more we can do. I would suggest some of the following. We can demand that the World Health Organization looks into China's role in COVID. You know, we cannot let this pass. I'm worried that we're starting to forget what's happened concerning coronavirus, and we should never ever forget where this began. So we should pressure the World Health Organization to look into that. We should not pander to Chinese sensitivities. So if Chinese diplomats complain about the Chinese people's feelings being hurt, we should frankly fight back and say, well, you're hurting the sensitivities of the West. You know, do you think we're going to tolerate these insults? So we should not be silent when Beijing casually insults us. Um, we shouldn't discriminate against individual Chinese. That would be wrong. However, we should insist that if Chinese nationals want to study or work in the West, they need to respect the West. And if they're going to promote the CCP, that's not going to go down well. And those idiots who say it's racism to oppose Chinese communist arrogance and Chinese nationalism, they need to get their heads screwed on correctly. You know, Western Appeasers also need to be challenged. I would even go so far as saying they need to be stigmatized because what they're doing, in my opinion, is unforgivable. They are actively pandering to tyranny. So that needs to be tackled. We need to scrap the Huawei deal. You know, we can look at Japan, we can look at South Korea. I refuse to believe that China is our only option in terms of digital trade. Um, we cannot be silent in the face of grave human rights situations like what's happening with the Uyghurs right now. We can robustly support our allies. I'm talking here about British positions. So when China insults Australia, we shouldn't be silent on that because that's as good as insulting Britain. It really is as bad as. Um, we must also insist that there is a difference between opposing the CCP or at least standing up to the CCP and xenophobia. We must routinely point out that opposing CCP tyranny is not the same as being xenophobic. So, we can continue to appreciate Chinese culture, Chinese food, and so on, but we have to be very assertive because more often than not, Chinese culture is used as a front. I believe that's what's happening in Confucius institutes. So, on the surface, it's just culture, calligraphy, language, that sort of thing. It's all harmless, right? But dig beneath the surface and look who's funding it, and it starts to become a bit more contentious. So, I take no pleasure from any of this, but I believe we really, really, really need to get assertive to this. Um, when the Beijing Winter Olympics happens in 2022, it would be an utter travesty if we allow an international torch relay equivalent to what happened in 2008, because that would be nothing but a propaganda victory for the CCP. Make no mistake about it. When they talk about international cooperation and harmony, what they really mean is Sino supremacy. And that's an insult to everyone this regime persecutes. Um, I believe there's a lot more we can do. I'm disgusted by the likes of Ofcom. I think they have shown utter weakness and moral cowardice. I'm disgusted by them, quite frankly. Um, the same with our universities that pander to the Chinese state. Not just with Confucius Institutes, but generally their outreach programs are all about basically groveling to the CCP. They claim it's about kind of a cultural partnership. We need to wake up. So we just need to really open our eyes to what's going on here. I am not saying we cut off all ties to China. That would be impossible. It is the world's second biggest economy and second most powerful country. So I think it would be impossible to cut off all ties. And there may be a few areas we can work together. For example, in perhaps issues around climate change, perhaps issues around combating the illegal wildlife trade. Although I believe the CCP could do a lot more on that. Um, so I'm not saying we cut off all ties, but if China starts taking basically random people hostage on trumped up charges and we give them an inch, they will take a mile. We need to see what's going on here. I think we need to vocalize in support of Canada. I mean, what's happening now is some Canadian diplomats are actually proposing a prisoner exchange. This is a very difficult situation because, on one hand, I'm hugely sympathetic to the families of the two Michaels. On the other hand, if that happens, it's a bit like what terrorists do. If they do a prisoner exchange and they release Meng Wanzhou, then they'll just do it again. So it's a very difficult situation. But maybe as a one-off, it could be done as a sort of see what the direction will be. But summed up, free nations need to understand the CCP is not our friend. We've tried the softly approach for too damn long. It hasn't worked, and this thug regime needs to be stood up to. If they get to the number one position on our watch, it will come back to haunt us.